The dust rose in clouds around her bare feet as they dragged her through the center of town. Elena Martinez had stopped screaming an hour ago. Her voice raw and broken, her throat filled with the taste of dirt and desperation. The rope around her wrists had worn through the skin, leaving angry red marks that wept blood onto her pale yellow dress. The one she had sewn herself just 3 months earlier, when she still believed this town held promise for her future. They called her a thief. They called her worse than that, words that men spat like tobacco juice, words that made the women turn their faces away while secretly nodding in agreement. The general store had been robbed 2 nights before, and someone had seen a woman matching her description near the building after midnight. Never mind that Elena had been home with her sick mother, tending to the fever that would take the old woman's life, just 6 days later. Never mind that she had no reason to steal, that she worked honest hours at the boarding house, scrubbing floors and washing linens until her hands cracked in blood. Never mind any of that. She was Mexican in a town that had grown suspicious of anyone whose skin held the kiss of the southern sun, whose last name ended in a vowel, whose first language was not English. The sheriff, a thick-necked man named Douglas Carver, held the rope that bound her. He walked with the swagger of someone who believed himself to be administering justice, though his eyes never quite met hers. Behind him, a crowd had gathered, perhaps 40 or 50 people, their faces a mixture of righteous anger and curious excitement. This was entertainment in a place where entertainment was scarce, where the monotony of frontier life was broken only by Sunday services and the occasional hanging. Elena stumbled, her knee striking a rock, and she fell forward onto the hard, packed earth. Someone in the crowd laughed. Sheriff Carver jerked the rope, and she felt her shoulders scream with pain as she was forced back to her feet. Her vision blurred with tears, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give these people that satisfaction. She had done nothing wrong, and even if they killed her for it, even if they strung her up from the old oak tree at the edge of town, she would die knowing the truth. They reached the town square, and the sheriff tied her to the whipping post, a weathered length of timber that had seen too much use in its short existence. The crowd formed a semicircle around her, and someone threw a rotten tomato that struck her shoulder, sending putrid juice running down her dress. A woman called out that she should be horsewhipped, that thieves deserved no mercy, that examples needed to be made. Elena closed her eyes and thought of her mother, lying in their small room above the boarding house, too weak to even call for water, too sick to know that her daughter was being destroyed in the street like a rabid dog. The sheriff was unlocking the door to his office, presumably to fetch the whip, when the sound of hoofbeats cut through the murmuring of the crowd. Elena opened her eyes and saw a man riding toward them on a gray horse, moving at an easy canter that suggested he had all the time in the world. The crowd parted for him, and as he drew closer, she recognized him as Jacob Turner, the rancher who lived 15 miles outside of town, on a spread of land that bordered the river. She had seen him perhaps 3 times in the 2 years she had lived here, always from a distance, always alone. He was known as a hard man, a solitary figure who kept to himself and had no use for town gossip or social niceties. Jacob Turner was somewhere past 40, with gray threading through his dark hair and lines carved deep around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun. He was tall and lean, built like a man who had worked hard every day of his life and expected to continue doing so until the day he died. His face was weathered leather, his hands scarred and calloused, his eyes the color of winter sky. He wore simple clothes, a faded blue shirt and worn leather vest, dusty trousers and boots that had been mended more than once. Everything about him spoke of a man who had no interest in appearances, who measured worth by different standards than the people of this town. He rode his horse right up to the whipping post and dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had been in the saddle since childhood. The crowd had gone quiet, watching him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Jacob Turner was not someone they could easily intimidate or dismiss. He owned land, he paid his bills, and he had a reputation for being a man of his word. More importantly, he was one of them, white and English, speaking, with a family name that went back 3 generations in these parts. What he said carried weight, whether they liked it or not. The rancher walked up to the sheriff and looked him directly in the eye. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but clear, carrying across the square in the sudden silence. "Cut her loose, Douglas." The sheriff's face flushed red. "Stay out of this, Turner. This doesn't concern you." "I'm making it my concern," Jacob said. "You've got the wrong person. This girl didn't rob your store. We have a witness," the sheriff said, his voice rising. "Mary Fletcher saw a Mexican woman near the store that night. This one here matches the description." Jacob looked at Alina for the first time, his gaze steady and assessing. She stared back at him, her chin raised despite the tears that now flowed freely down her cheeks. She saw no pity in his eyes, no condescension, just a careful evaluation, as if he were judging the quality of a horse he might purchase. "Mary Fletcher is half blind and sees threats in every shadow," Jacob said, turning back to the sheriff. "You're about to whip an innocent woman because you're too lazy to find the real thief." The crowd stirred, and angry voices rose. Someone called out that Turner had no right to interfere, that justice needed to be served. The sheriff's hand went to the gun at his hip, and for a moment, Alina thought there would be violence, that this stranger who had spoken up for her would die in the street, shot down for defending someone he didn't even know. But Jacob Turner didn't reach for his own weapon. Instead, he smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. "You really want to do this, Douglas? You want to draw on me in front of all these witnesses? Because I promise you, if you pull that gun, you'd better make your first shot count." The sheriff's hand fell away from his pistol. The crowd had gone silent again, tension thick in the air. Alana could barely breathe, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. "She's innocent," Jacob said again, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "I know it because I saw the real thieves. 2 white men, brothers by the look of them, riding north on the canyon road yesterday morning. They were leading a pack mule loaded with goods, and when they saw me, they took off at a gallop. I didn't think much of it at the time. Figured they were just nervous strangers. But now I know better. Why should we believe you?" Someone in the crowd called out, "Why didn't you report this yesterday?" "Because I didn't know about the robbery until just now," Jacob said. "I came into town to buy supplies and heard the commotion. And I'm telling you now, you've got the wrong person." The sheriff's jaw worked, and Alina could see the calculation in his eyes. He wanted to dismiss Jacob's testimony, wanted to proceed with the punishment, but he couldn't afford to openly challenge a man of Turner's standing. Not without proof. Not without making himself look like a fool or worse, a coward. "I want to see proof," the sheriff finally said. "You show me evidence that what you're saying is true, and I'll consider letting her go." "My word isn't proof enough," Jacob asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not when it goes against a witness account, and the facts as we know them." Jacob was silent for a long moment, and Alina felt hope dying in her chest. He had tried to help her, this strange man, but it wasn't enough. They would whip her anyway, and then they would probably run her out of town, and her mother would die alone in that boarding house room with no one to hold her hand or whisper prayers over her failing body. Then Jacob said, "Fine, give me 3 days. I'll track those men down and bring back your stolen goods. If I can't do that, you can have your punishment. But until then, this woman goes free." The crowd erupted in protests. The sheriff shook his head. "That's not how this works, Turner. We have our justice system. We don't just let criminals walk free on someone's word. Then arrest me instead," Jacob said. "Lock me up for 3 days. I'll give you my word I won't try to escape. You can have my bond. If I can't prove she's innocent within 3 days, you can add whatever charges you want against me. Interfering with justice, aiding a criminal, whatever you like. But she goes free until then." The sheriff stared at him, clearly trying to find the trap, the angle, the reason why a man would put himself in such a position for a stranger. Alina was wondering the same thing. Why would this rancher risk his freedom, his reputation, perhaps even his life, for someone he had never even spoken to before this moment. "All right," the sheriff finally said. "3 days. But she doesn't leave town. She stays where I can see her. And Turner, if you're lying to me, if this is some kind of trick, I'll make sure you regret it." Jacob nodded and walked over to Alina. He pulled a knife from his belt, and she flinched. But he only used it to cut through the ropes binding her wrists. His hands were gentle as he examined the raw skin, and he frowned at the damage. "You'll need to clean these," he said quietly. "Don't let them get infected." Alina found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He looked at her again with those winter sky eyes. "Because I know what it's like to be accused of something you didn't do. And because someone needs to stand up when things aren't right." He turned to the crowd. "Any of you lay a hand on this woman while I'm gone, and you'll answer to me when I get back. That's a promise." Then he mounted his horse and rode out of town without another word, leaving Alina standing by the whipping post, free but not safe, saved but not yet vindicated. The crowd dispersed slowly, shooting dark looks her way, and she knew that Jacob Turner's protection only extended so far. She was still alone in a town that hated her, still vulnerable, still one false move away from destruction. She made her way back to the boarding house, her legs shaking so badly she could barely walk. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, met her at the door with pursed lips and cold eyes. "You've caused quite a disturbance, girl. I don't need this kind of trouble in my establishment." "I've done nothing wrong," Alina said, her voice stronger now. "Mr. Turner is proving it." "Or Mr. Turner is a fool," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "And you're lucky he's a fool with influence. But luck runs out. You have 3 days to find somewhere else to stay. I won't have a thief under my roof." Alina wanted to argue, wanted to scream that she was innocent, that she had worked hard and honestly for this woman for 2 years, but she knew it would accomplish nothing. Mrs. Henderson had already made up her mind, and no amount of evidence would change it. Some people needed someone to hate, someone to blame, someone to punish for all the fears and frustrations of their own lives. Alina had been chosen for that role, and there was no escaping it. She climbed the stairs to the small room she shared with her mother, and found the old woman sleeping fitfully, her breathing shallow and labored. Alina dipped a cloth in the water basin and wiped her mother's fevered brow, whispering soft words in Spanish, promises that everything would be all right, that they would get through this. She wasn't sure she believed any of it, but the words brought comfort anyway. A ritual of hope in the face of despair. The next 3 days passed in a blur of anxiety and isolation. Alina stayed in the room, caring for her mother and venturing out only to fetch water and what meager food she could afford. People stared at her in the streets, and once, a group of boys threw rocks at her, calling her names until the blacksmith, a decent man named Thomas Wright, chased them off. He was one of the few who didn't seem to believe she was guilty, but even he wouldn't speak to her directly, wouldn't risk his own reputation by showing her kindness. On the morning of the 3rd day, her mother's fever finally broke. The old woman opened her eyes and smiled at Alina, really smiled for the first time in weeks. "Mija," she whispered. "Why do you look so worried?" Alina told her everything, and her mother listened with growing concern. When the story was done, the old woman reached out, took her daughter's hand, and said softly, "This man, this rancher, he's a good man. He's come into your life for a reason, to help you. I don't know why he's doing this," Alina admitted. "I don't understand it. Some people have goodness in them that runs deep," her mother said. "They don't need a reason to do what's right. They just do it." At noon, Alina heard shouting from the street below. She went to the window and saw a crowd gathering in the square. Her heart began to race. This was it. Either Jacob Turner had returned with proof of her innocence, or he had failed, and she would face the whip after all. She kissed her mother's forehead and told her to rest, then made her way downstairs and out into the harsh sunlight. The crowd was larger than before, perhaps 100 people, all pressed close to see what would happen. The sheriff stood in the center with his arms crossed, looking grim. And there, riding into town on his gray horse, was Jacob Turner. But he wasn't alone. Behind him, bound and tied to their saddles, were two men who looked exactly as he had described them. Rough, faced brothers with mean eyes and bitter expressions. And trailing behind them was a pack mule laden with goods, everything that had been stolen from the general store and more. Jacob dismounted and handed the reins to the sheriff. "Here are your thieves, Douglas. Found them camped about 30 miles north, just like I said. They've already confessed. They hit 3 other towns before they got here. You'll find stolen property from all of them." The sheriff examined the men and the goods, his face growing redder by the moment. The crowd had gone silent, and Alina felt dozens of eyes turning toward her, some ashamed, some resentful, some still stubbornly convinced she must have been involved somehow. Jacob walked over to her and nodded, a simple acknowledgement that sent a wave of relief crashing through her body, so powerful she thought she might collapse. "Miss Martinez?" the sheriff said stiffly, not meeting her eyes. "It appears we were mistaken. You're free to go, no apology." No acknowledgement of what they had put her through, of the trauma and humiliation and pain. Just a grudging admission that they had been wrong, delivered with all the grace of a man swallowing broken glass. Elena wanted to spit at his feet, wanted to curse them all for their cruelty and their cowardice, but she held her tongue. She had learned long ago that anger, however justified, would only make things worse. She turned to Jacob Turner, this strange man who had risked everything for her. "Thank you," she said, and the words seemed hopelessly inadequate for what he had done. He looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. It was the right thing to do. Nothing more. "It was everything," she said. "You gave me my life back." He nodded and started to turn away, but she reached out and touched his arm. He froze, looking down at her hand, and she realized she had never actually touched him before, never been this close. She could smell the dust and sweat of his hard ride, see the exhaustion in his eyes, the lines of pain around his mouth. He had pushed himself to the edge of endurance to save her, and she wondered again why. What drove a man to such lengths for a stranger? "My mother is ill," she said. "She's getting better now, but when she's well enough to travel, I need to leave this place. I can't stay here. They'll never forgive me for being right when they were wrong." Jacob was quiet for a moment, and she prepared herself for polite excuses, for the withdrawal that always came when people realized they had involved themselves too deeply in someone else's problems. But instead, he said, "I have a ranch. It's not much, but there's always work that needs doing. I could use help with cooking and cleaning, and when your mother is well, there might be work for her too. The pay isn't great, but room and board are included. You'd be safe there." Elena stared at him, certain she had misunderstood. "You're offering me a job. If you want it. But you don't know me. You don't know anything about me." "I know you're innocent," he said. "I know you're a hard worker, based on what Mrs. Henderson let slip before she remembered she was supposed to hate you. And I know you're loyal to your mother. That's enough. People will talk," Elena said. "A Mexican woman living on your ranch. They'll say terrible things." Jacob shrugged. "Let them talk. I stopped caring what people in this town think a long time ago." She wanted to ask him why, wanted to know what had happened to make him so isolated, so separate from the community he had been born into. But those were questions for another time, if there ever was another time. Right now, she just needed to accept this gift he was offering, this chance at a new beginning. "Yes," she said. "We'll come. Thank you." He nodded once, then mounted his horse and rode away, leaving her standing in the square with the crowd dispersing around her. Some people averted their eyes as they passed. Others glared at her with open hostility. No one apologized. No one acknowledged their mistake or their cruelty. It was as if the past 3 days had been a bad dream that everyone wanted to forget, except that Alina would carry the scars forever, both visible and invisible. She returned to her mother and told her about Jacob's offer. The old woman smiled and said it was the answer they had been hoping for. Alina wasn't so sure about any greater design behind it, but she was grateful nonetheless. 2 weeks later, when her mother was strong enough to travel, They packed their few belongings and hired a wagon to take them out to the Turner Ranch. The ranch was exactly as Jacob had described it, nothing fancy. Just a simple house with a barn and corrals, pastures stretching out toward the river, and the endless sky above. It was isolated and quiet, and after the hostility of town, the silence felt like mercy. Jacob showed them to a small cabin behind the main house, clean and sturdy, with 2 beds and a wood stove and windows that looked out toward the mountains. It was the nicest place Elena had ever lived. The work was hard but satisfying. She cooked meals for Jacob and helped with the house, washing clothes and mending torn fabric and keeping everything clean. Her mother, as she regained her strength, began tending a small garden, growing vegetables and herbs that added fresh flavor to their meals. Jacob was quiet and kept to himself, but he was fair and kind in his own gruff way, and Elena found herself relaxing in a way she never had in town, letting down the defensive walls she had built around herself. Months passed, and Elena began to understand why Jacob lived the way he did. One evening, as she was serving dinner, she noticed a photograph on the mantel that she had never paid attention to before. It showed Jacob as a younger man, standing with a woman and 2 small children, a boy and a girl. They all looked happy, frozen in a moment of joy that now existed only in that fading image. "Is that your family?" she asked before she could stop herself. Jacob followed her gaze and nodded slowly. "Was. Cholera took them 8 years ago. All 3 of them gone within a week." Elena felt her heart break for him. "I'm so sorry. After they died, people in town kept trying to help," he said, staring at the photograph, "bringing food, offering sympathy, trying to set me up with eligible women. They meant well, but I couldn't stand it. Couldn't stand the pity, couldn't stand being around people who still had their families intact. So I came out here and stayed. It's better this way." "Is it?" Elena asked gently. "Better to be alone." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. Maybe not always. Maybe sometimes the right people come along, and being alone isn't necessary anymore. They held each other's gaze for a long moment, and Elena felt something stirring in her chest, something she had thought died the day she was dragged through the street and tied to the whipping post. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of trust, or maybe even the first small flutter of something deeper, something that would take time to grow but had already planted its roots. The seasons turned, and Elena and her mother made the ranch their home. The old woman's health continued to improve in the clean air and peaceful surroundings, and she often joked that she would live to be 100 now, that she was away from that terrible boarding house. Jacob remained quiet, but he seemed less lonely, less withdrawn. Sometimes Elena would catch him smiling at something her mother said, or watching her as she worked in the garden, and she would feel that flutter in her chest again, growing stronger each time. One evening, nearly a year after they had arrived, Jacob asked Elena to walk with him down to the river. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the air was filled with the sound of crickets and the gentle rush of water over stones. They stood on the bank in comfortable silence, and then Jacob said, "I want to tell you something." Elena waited, her heart beating faster. "When I saw you tied to that post," he said, "when I saw what they were about to do to you, I saw my wife. Not that you look like her, but I saw someone innocent being destroyed by people who were supposed to protect her. My wife got sick because the town doctor was drunk when she needed him. He gave her the wrong medicine, made everything worse, and by the time a real doctor arrived from the next county, it was too late. And nobody held him accountable. Nobody even acknowledged that he'd done anything wrong. They just moved on, and he kept practicing medicine, and I had to live with knowing that the people I'd trusted my whole life had failed me in the worst possible way." He turned to face her. "So when I saw you there, I couldn't walk away. I couldn't let it happen again. I had to do something, had to be the person I wished someone had been for me." Elena reached out and took his hand. "You saved my life. You saved mine too," he said. "You and your mother. This ranch, it was just a place to hide, but now it's a home again. Because of you. She understood what he was asking, what he was offering, even though he hadn't said the words yet. And she understood her own answer, clear and certain despite all the reasons it should have been complicated, despite their differences in background and culture and the world's cruel judgment. None of that mattered. What mattered was that they had both been broken and both been healing, and somewhere in that shared journey, they had found each other. "I'd like to stay," she said. "Not just as help, as family, if that's what you're asking." "It is," Jacob said. "I know it won't be easy. People will talk, like you said. Some will be worse than others. But I don't care about that anymore. I care about this, about us, about building something real and good in spite of everything that's tried to break us." Elena kissed him then, gentle and brief, a promise of what could be. And as the sun sank below the horizon and darkness fell over the land, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt safe. She felt seen. She felt like she belonged. They married quietly 3 months later. Just the three of them and a traveling preacher, who asked no questions and offered only blessings. Elena's mother cried happy tears and said she had always known this was meant to be. Jacob smiled more in those days than Elena had ever seen, and she realized that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending the pain had never existed. It was about building something new on top of the scars, about choosing to live fully despite everything that had tried to destroy you. The town, when word eventually reached them, reacted with predictable outrage. Some people said Jacob had lost his mind, that he had dishonored his first wife's memory. Others said Elena had tricked him somehow, used Mexican witchcraft or feminine wiles to trap a grieving widower. The sheriff made it clear that they weren't welcome in town anymore, that supplies would be sold to them, but nothing more. No hospitality, no recognition, no place in the community. Jacob and Elena accepted this exile with equal parts sadness and relief. They had each other, they had the ranch, and they had Elena's mother, who proved to be exactly the family they all needed. The old woman told stories and sang songs, filled the house with laughter and cooking smells and the comfort of being truly loved. And when she finally passed away 3 years later, peacefully in her sleep, they buried her on the hill overlooking the river and marked her grave with a simple stone that read, "Beloved mother and friend." Years went by, and the ranch prospered. Jacob and Elena worked side by side, building something that would last. Something that honored all the pain they had endured, and all the strength it had taken to survive. They never had children of their own, but they took in strays, both human and animal, anyone who needed a place to belong and was willing to work for it. Mexican workers who faced discrimination elsewhere found employment and respect at the Turner Ranch. Women escaping bad situations found safety there. Children who had been orphaned or abandoned found a home. The town never apologized. The people who had been ready to whip Elena, who had called her thief and worse, who had demanded her blood, never acknowledged their mistake or their cruelty. But it didn't matter anymore. Elena had learned that some people would never see their own darkness, would never take responsibility for their actions, would never grow beyond their prejudices and fears, and she had learned that her worth didn't depend on their recognition or their approval. On quiet evenings, when the work was done and they sat together on the porch, watching the sun set over the land they had built together, Jacob would sometimes take Elena's hand and say, "I'm glad I spoke up that day." And Elena would smile and say, "I'm glad you saw me." Because that was what it came down to in the end, being seen, being known, being believed when the whole world insisted you were guilty, when the mob demanded your punishment, when justice itself seemed bent on your destruction. Jacob Turner had looked at her and seen not a stereotype or a scapegoat, but a human being who deserved the truth. And in doing so, he had given her not just her freedom, but the chance to build a life worth living. The scars on Elena's wrists never fully faded. Sometimes she would trace them with her fingers and remember that terrible day, the rope cutting into her skin, the crowd calling for her blood, the absolute certainty that she would die in that dusty street, forgotten and unmourned. But then she would look around at the home she had built, at the man who had chosen to stand beside her, at the life they had created together, out of the ashes of their respective tragedies, and she would feel something stronger than anger, or bitterness, or even satisfaction. She would feel grateful. Grateful for the rancher who said she was innocent when everyone else demanded her guilt. Grateful for the courage he had shown and the example he had set. Grateful for second chances and new beginnings, and the stubborn resilience of the human heart. And on those quiet evenings, with the sunset painting the sky and Jacob's hand warm in hers, Elena would close her eyes and whisper a prayer of thanks to whatever force had brought them together, to whatever cosmic accident had placed the right person in the right place at precisely the right moment. Because sometimes, in a world full of cruelty and injustice, someone steps forward and says the words that change everything. You're innocent. And sometimes, those two words are enough to save a life, to build a home, to create a love that endures long after the mob has dispersed and the dust has settled, and the story has faded into legend. Sometimes, being seen is all that matters. And sometimes, the loneliest people are the ones with the most love to give, if only they can find someone worthy of receiving it.